Hi, I'm Phil Tierney from Chester, Connecticut. You are listening to ICRV Radio, the stream feeding the River Valley.
And we want to welcome everybody to Archaeology of Connecticut. And Sarah Sportman, our state archaeologist. Sarah, how are you?
Good, Dave. Thanks. Welcome, everybody, to our September episode of the Archaeology of Connecticut. Before we get started with tonight's show, I just wanted to let you know that due to the widespread power outages at the beginning of August, our show last month on the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA, had to be postponed, and we're planning to cover that topic on our November show, so please tune in if you were hoping to hear that one. For our last show of the summer, we decided to focus on underwater archaeology. So tonight, my co-host, Scott Brady, the president of the Friends of the Office of State Archaeology.
Hello, everybody.
Here with, hi, Scott, with two very knowledgeable guests. David Robinson, the Director and Chief Archaeologist of the Massachusetts Board of Underwater Archaeological Resources, and Dr. Christopher Goodwin, President and Director of Research at Christopher Goodwin and Associates Incorporated. Both of our guests have extensive experience in underwater archaeology here in New England and as well as in other regions. And tonight we're going to cover topics ranging from shipwrecks to submerged landscapes to climate change and its impact on our cultural resources. So I think the best way to get started is to give each of our guests just a little bit of a chance to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about them. So, Chris, can we start with you? We'd love to hear a little bit about your background, how you got into underwater archaeology, and some of the projects you've worked on.
Sure, Sarah. My initial journey into underwater archaeology was completely accidental. I'd studied anthropology and archaeology during my baccalaureate program, but I was also a diver, and I got hired on at an underwater habitat in the Caribbean and moved down to the islands. And happily, the underwater habitat, where saturation divers were doing lots of experiments offshore, had a complete toolkit. And on our days off, we got to do some pretty cool things. And one day off, I was offshore about a half a mile with a little mini-sub poking around with scuba gear and found an archaeological site. This was off the west coast of Puerto Rico. And bottom of the Caribbean was covered with pottery from kind of early Taino period of Puerto Rico, and that got me to thinking that underwater archaeology was something that really hadn't been done a lot in those neck of the woods or stateside. This was 1971, 72, and I just caught the bug, and then pursued a couple of graduate degrees, worked variously as a research associate at Yale Peabody Museum, then at the Smithsonian. I was there for a couple of years, and then bailed out immediately after the National Historic Preservation Act was codified, and on a wing and a prayer, everybody thought I was loco to give up a slot with the government, but started a consulting firm figuring that somebody would need a guy like me who wanted to do field work, and that was 40 years ago or so, and I've been doing it ever since. I've worked on a lot of really interesting nautical underwater archaeological projects. Over the past few years, we did a lot of remote sensing survey work and data analyses in Long Island Sound waters of Connecticut as part of the Hurricane Sandy recovery effort, located a lot of shipwrecks, and documented them, drafted some guidelines for the State Historic Preservation Officer to help them understand how to deal with applications for offshore projects, developed a GIS of offshore archaeological sites that includes all of the various targets other agencies had mapped over the years, and had a lot of fun. But we've worked on underwater projects, along the Atlantic coast, in the Chesapeake Bay, up the Connecticut River, rivers of the Deep South, the bayous of Louisiana, Wakulla River in Florida, where Johnny Weissmuller starred in the Tarzan movies, a number of projects on the Mississippi River, and worked with Dave Robinson on a couple of interesting projects that were really large-scale data recoveries of historic ships. One, the wreck of the Columbus in the Chesapeake Bay, still is the oldest extant surviving marine steam engine in the United States. The other one, the Kentucky in the Red River of Louisiana, sank a week after the Appomattox Courthouse Agreement was signed ending the Civil War with 200 Confederate parolees and their horses on board. And we had a lot of fun with that project as well. So, been doing this for a long time, and I still love it. I'm old enough to retire, and I have no plans to do so.
Fascinating. People think about, I don't think a lot of people even realize how much archaeology is done terrestrially, but the whole underwater thing opens up a whole new avenue that I think people aren't even aware of. Dave, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Sure. So I was just doing a math on a piece of paper here, thinking about how long I've been looking at shipwrecks, and it's a long time. It's 41 years. I got certified to scuba dive when I was 15. I grew up in Narragansett, Rhode Island, and I'd always been around the water. Had my first mask when I was 3, and was just always fascinated by what I could see, what a mask allowed me to see in this completely foreign and strange world that was beneath the surface of the water. And that interest just continued through my young life. I got certified when I was 15 to scuba dive, and my entree into underwater archaeology really came as a diver. Some friends and I learned about a shipwreck that had sunk off of Bonnet Point in Narragansett, and we'd get our gear on and ride our bikes, our scuba gear down to the site, and we found it. The wreck of a large steamboat, one of the Providence to Stonington Line steamers, sank in 1880, and we turned our interest into a school project and mapped the site, recovered a couple of spikes from the wreck, and found out that applied learning and applying things that you were really interested in and enjoyed doing to sort of an academic pursuit was a really exciting thing to do. And that experience really kind of carried me through my career. I went to URI and got degrees in art and anthropology, and then when I got done with my undergrad, I applied to Texas A&M University to the nautical archaeology program there, and the topic of my thesis was yet another steamboat, the Indiana, that sank in Lake Superior in 1858. And with a young family looking for work, I ended up actually starting my career in cultural resource management, which is most of what I've done over the last almost 30 years now. But that career started working on the Columbus steamboat wreck that Chris just mentioned a little while ago. And since then, it's been an amazing, really an amazing ride through lots of different states, working all up and down the eastern seaboard, mostly here in the Northeast, but in the Gulf of Mexico. Everything from remote sensing surveys and diving on magnetic anomalies, the mouth of the Mississippi River, to riding in the NR-1, the U.S. Navy's nuclear research submarine off the edge of the continental shelf looking for paleo shorelines. And most recently, last year, I've just taken on a new challenge. I am now the director of the Massachusetts Board of Underwater Archaeological Resources, which is an enormous job. The state of Massachusetts has over 3,500 known shipwrecks in state waters, and the Massachusetts Board of Underwater Archaeological Resources jurisdiction extends both along the coast and state waters, but also in the interior and all the freshwater bodies that we have, rivers, streams, wetlands, and ponds and lakes. So it's a big job, and it really is I couldn't be luckier. It's a really great position to be in, to be in charge of the board as the sole trustee of the Commonwealth's Underwater Cultural Heritage, and and be able to work with the public, both through permitting and also through educational outreach, celebrating the rich resources the state of Massachusetts has. So, yeah, that's I think that's a fairly brief summary of the ride that I've had in this career. It's been extraordinary.
Yeah, you've both had amazing and extraordinary careers with lots of fantastic sites. And I really want to get into talking about some of these projects in detail. But before we do that, can we start with kind of the basics? How does underwater archaeology differ from terrestrial archaeology or archaeology on land? We talk about that all the time and all different methods and types of sites and the varieties of kind of approaches, but underwater archaeology is something we never covered before on the show. So it'd be great if you could tell our listeners a little bit about how it works and how it's different and similar.
Sure. You know, I think the biggest difference is the commute. And it's the thing I think that people always think of when they think of underwater archaeology. They think of the diving. You know, that is an important part of it, getting to the sites that you can't otherwise see unless you go underwater, either in person or remotely, is, of course, a big part of what we do. And technologies that are required to work in an environment that is really not hospitable to air-breathing organisms like we are. We're terrestrial creatures, but the only way to access the sites and the seafloor and the bottom is through utilizing technology. And so one of the things that I think makes underwater archaeology different from a methodological standpoint is that a lot of the technologies and methodologies we use in doing underwater archaeology are non-disturbing because of the fact that in many cases, most of the places that I've worked, I haven't been able to see more than a few inches underwater. It always seems like the projects that we get would be in places that the visibility underwater wasn't very good. And also, even in places where the visibility is good, you can only see, a few dozen feet. So in order to cover some of the large survey areas that we are, responsible for when we do our work underwater, you need equipment that allows you to see sort of the landscape that's submerged. So, we use a lot of different types of remote sensing equipment in our work, and that includes things like side-scan sonar, which is something that technology that a lot of people are fairly familiar with. Anybody who's gone to see, if they're expecting to have a baby and they go in and have an ultrasound, that's the same kind of technology that's applied for mapping the surface of the seafloor when we use side-scan sonar. Then there's magnetometers, which measure the Earth's magnetic field, and if there's any anomalous deposits of iron that are associated with the fasteners in a ship, or ordnance, guns, cannon, ammunition, or cargo, those are going to show up as these strange, anomalous readings in the Earth's magnetic field. And then we also have technology that allows us to see below the surface of the seafloor, things called sub-bottom profilers. That it's another acoustic instrument like side-scan that gives us a cross-sectional view of the different stratigraphies based on their density that allows us to see paleo channels that are buried under marine sediment. It allows us to see ballast piles of buried shipwrecks. And then we can use bathymetry too. We've got an instrument called a multi-beam seismometer that allows us to map the topography, underwater topography or bathymetry of the seafloor. So we can look for the same kind of features almost like you look for when you're doing terrestrial archaeology. You look at aerial. So, and then, there's submarines and there's remotely operated vehicles that we can use. So there's this whole range of different, really pretty fascinating technologies that we have to bring to bear in addition to ourselves. And, we do use trowels and underwater, and we do dig underwater. It's a little different than we do on land, but there's similarities. It's still archaeology underwater. So,
yeah, Dave, let me interject that ultimately the kind of archaeology that we do in the marine environment is for the same objectives, for the same purposes, even though the methodologies may be somewhat different, that terrestrial archaeologists would look at. We're looking for clues that help interpret the past. We're looking for the material remains of the past. We're ultimately looking to be able to talk about the people that left them there, how they got there, why they got there, what they represent from a cultural standpoint. So the objectives are the same, but the toolkit is different. They've talked about all the technology that can be brought to bear. I would interject that that technology has grown by leaps and bounds in terms of the quality of data that we are getting now. When Dave and I worked on the Columbus project in the Chesapeake Bay a number of years ago, many years ago now, Dave was the project illustrator, and so he was charged with drawing the components of the shipwreck on the bottom of the bay in, at best, very turbid, water, not great visibility. But he took all the measurements, just as one would do on terra firma, and triangulated positions, and then sketched by feel if he couldn't see, in order to get a site plan, just as archaeologists do on dry land. Now, Dave mentioned the multi-beam echo sounder. Now we're getting fabulous 3D imagery of stuff sticking up above the bottom of the ocean that you can actually take very accurate measurements with. So the technology has come a long way, but the objectives are still the same, and the methodologies are just the same in that they help you study and interpret what you're looking at, just as an archaeologist does on dry land.
And Sarah, I just, if I can add too, that one of the things that I think is a mistake that people often make is that they think of the shoreline and what's underwater and what's on land in terms of cultural materials, cultural sites, as somehow separate. And really, what we find underwater and we look for underwater is part of a continuum of a landscape that extends from the terrestrial landscape into and underneath the water, and it's something that I've been frustrated and intrigued by at the same time, that we have this in archaeology, as archaeologists, that we have this mental sort of break between the land and water in terms of the archaeological record that has proven to be a hindrance at times.
It's interesting you say that, because we recently discussed on this show the fact that sometimes we get hung up on the current borders. Connecticut is different than Massachusetts, where, 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 years ago, it really didn't matter. I mean, there was no Connecticut, there was no Massachusetts, and those borders can sometimes be problematic. And it's just another case of us having to think a little bit more total picture, and continue that into the water landscape that exists out there. I'm curious, because I don't think a lot of people are really cognizant. I think when most people think of underwater archaeology, they're thinking almost strictly shipwrecks. But I mean, you're talking about cultural landscapes that are underwater. Could you guys talk a little bit about that, and how difficult or easy it is to find those, and what kind of stories those landscapes can help us understand?
Yeah, we both can talk to it. You want to go first, Chris, or you want me to?
Go ahead. You've been playing with drown sites now more than anybody else in New England for a while, so.
Yeah, so one of the things that many people don't realize is that sea level has risen, at least here in the Northeast and globally, but as a result of the warming of the Earth at the end of the last glacial epoch, some 22 to 26,000 years ago, when Earth started to warm, the glacier started to melt, all that water that was trapped in the ice in a much colder global climate began to melt and began to refill all the world's oceans. And as a result, here in southern New England, we've had sea level rise over the last 18 to 20,000 years of about 400 feet. And so when we think of the continental shelf 20,000, 22,000 years ago, it was not submerged. It was dry land that you could have walked out, some 100 miles off our coast. It's this massive landscape that, based on what we're learning and based on the oral traditions that we learned from talking to the indigenous people of this land, we know that there were ancient people here that were living on that landscape in addition to all the flora and fauna that were there as well. And now it's all submerged. And so, you're right, for a very long time, the training that I got and a lot of people got in underwater archaeology was totally focused on shipwrecks. Because, and this speaks to that break that I was talking about, the terrestrial archaeologists, they kind of fall into the same categories now that underwater archaeologists fall into in terms of being historical archaeologists or prehistoric or pre-contact archaeologists. And the people mostly working on pre-contact sites on land, they're not working underwater. And they, sort of the archaeological record would end at the shoreline. But we know that that's not the case. And so there's been, largely it's been driven by archaeological compliance, laws, federal and state laws that require marine archaeological investigations to be done prior to the development of offshore energy projects or dredging that's involving a federal agency to do these pre-impact surveys. And it's really through sort of that realm that a lot of the research has been done to try to identify paleo landforms that could contain ancient native sites. And the advances that have been made in the last 15 years, it's very recent. It's this whole realm of underwater archaeology that has really just begun to tell us a lot about these old landforms. And so we've had in the last 15 years, 10 years, had to develop kind of the methodologies and really think outside the box as to how do you even approach this as a problem. And what we found is that, the first thing to do is, not think about it as we're looking for discrete sites, but really we're trying to understand what's been preserved of the old paleo landforms after inundation. The inundation process is a destructive one. And so much of the surfaces of the old landforms on today's continental shelf have been redistributed and eroded and moved. So we've, in this last decade, begun to understand what are the instances when those paleo landforms are preserved, where do they occur, and then begin to apply testing methodologies that are essentially the same as on land, with coring and underwater excavation, but also primarily the remote sensing and non-disturbance survey techniques that we can use to try to identify sites. And that's something that's developing now, and fortunately it's something here in southern New England that's been developing with involvement of indigenous communities, because these are their ancestral sites, so it's absolutely essential and really important that the indigenous communities here are involved in that research and that development of this new area of looking at the land archaeologically.
So when one does an archaeological survey of a large area, typically what you do is develop kind of a predictive model or a probability model of where things should be located, where they're likely not to be located. When Dave talked about, marine transgression being a destructive process that, would have erased vestiges of habitable land offshore, the flip side of that coin is that there are areas that are far more likely to contain drowned or submerged pre-contact sites. I've been lecturing for the past, 10, 12 years about the study of climate change from an archaeological perspective. And one of the early slides in my PowerPoint shows the former outline of the peninsula of Florida. And I make the simple observation that at the beginning of the modern geological era, the Holocene, if there had been a Tampa, it would have been 155 miles out into the Gulf of Mexico. What Dave is saying about New England is the case as well. And, Long Island Sound and the Connecticut waters of Long Island Sound, used to have a lake, a giant paleo lake, Lake Connecticut. And, it went through a series of changes, and then ultimately sea level rise came up. but you have to be kind of at the nexus of the sciences to practice underwater archaeology. I tell people that anthropology and archaeology are at the nexus of the sciences. You have to understand, geology, geomorphology. If you're going to get the data you want, you have to know something about the various biologies. One way to look at climate change is with pollen data. You can get those from marine cores too. It's the same kind of problem solving in a different milieu. But I think that one of the things that archaeologists have to offer is a long-term perspective on how things have changed, how they have gotten to where they are. And oh, by the way, that might have some pretty important ramifications for what we're looking at in terms of sea level rise and climate change. Last year we worked on a project in Boston Harbor. It was a curious project. It involved exhuming a smallpox cemetery from a quarantine island in Boston Harbor. And what made it even more curious was that we ended up reinterring the remains during the middle of the pandemic. But we actually developed a model of the rate of loss and tried to pin down the loss of archaeological sites on the islands in Boston Harbor and around the harbor using the best data available on sea level rise. And so we had a cohort of other cemeteries that go underwater in 2014 if the current model of sea level rise obtains, kind of the consensus model. But what we found on that island was that technically, using the current models, that island shouldn't go underwater until sometime after 2040. But the last couple of years, ice flows have gone across that island in the winter. In other words, it's already going underwater. The models of sea level rise are still not aggressive enough. So it's a process of discovery. But when you talk to the captains on the vessels out there and listen to their descriptions of the flooding, which is why the graves had to be exhumed, and that the ice flows went completely across the island, you realize that things are changing at a more rapid pace than had been expected previously. So.
And one of the things that I didn't mention in terms of how underwater archaeology and terrestrial archaeology are different is that we've been talking about the destructive effects of sea level rise, but there are also, once things are submerged, there's a preservative effect of being underwater. And the best analogy I can think of is if you think of you're not paying attention. You're playing with a rubber band. You're kind of stretching it, and all of a sudden it snaps and it hurts your hand, and you suddenly realize what you were doing. If you think about that as an analogy for environmental fluctuations, environmental change, sites that are submerged in underwater context generally tend to be much more static environmentally than sites on land that are exposed to great fluctuations in wet, cold, or wet, dry, hot, cold, and it's like stretching that rubber band. Material things break down more rapidly in those types of environments, in a terrestrial environment, than they do in an underwater environment that has low oxygen levels, light levels, sort of consistently. Once things are submerged and then buried underneath marine sediments, it's an amazing preservative environment for organic material in particular. We think about ships and wooden piers and things that are eaten up by teredo worms, moths that bore into the wood. But once the wooden wreckage of a ship, once you get down to below the mud line, usually the bottoms of these holes are preserved incredibly well, and wrecks can, the oldest shipwrecks that we have in the world are several thousands of years old. I've worked on submerged Stone Age sites off the coast of Denmark that are 6,000 to 7,000 to 9,000 years old, where we have preserved wooden remains, preserved food remains on these sites. So it's one of the other things that makes underwater archaeology, I think, important, and it makes the submerged environment important as a source of information, that you've just got incredible preservation that you don't have typically on land.
in a nice anaerobic environment covered by, a nice sediment cap. In Long Island Sound, that's variable, but you have to, in order to understand the potential for preservation, you have to know something about the geology and the processes that might have affected those sites. So if you're in an area where there's erosion and no deposition, that's not real conducive to preserving archaeological deposits, right? So in the easternmost portion of Long Island Sound, the sediments are highly eroded and have been transported to the west. But in other parts of the Sound, in the central and western Long Island Sound, you've got low energy levels, which have allowed fine-grained material to kind of blanket the surface with negligible reworking. And so, there you have a higher potential of finding, archaeological sites. The real issue in terms of doing that, as Dave mentioned, the process of discovery is driven by permit applications for federal permits from the Army Corps or from Bureau of Ocean Energy Management or something like that. And the process of gathering the kind of data that one needs to address, those kinds of research questions is really expensive. So it takes a large budget to make it happen. That does happen, however, when the federal permit is required, and that's when we have the opportunity to discover things that we haven't seen before. Dave's very familiar with the offshore wind farm leases. There's an awful lot of coring going on offshore that are producing interesting data sets that will help us look at the depositional environment, look at it from a paleo-environmental standpoint, and identify areas of higher archaeological potential. He also talked to the new generation array of sub-bottom profiling equipment, and typically two different units are used. One's for looking at the shallow sub-bottom. One is used to look deeper. The shallow one is called a chirp in the vernacular. The deeper one's a boomer because it takes more energy to get down deeper. But offshore projects now typically require development of a ground model where you actually can look at the sub-bottom topography, if you will, and stratigraphy, and figure out, for example, if you have a delta, fluvial system of rivers, a kind of dendritic pattern that one sees, and then once you know the age of those geological deposits, you can make a quick determination of whether or not people were there at the time. Then you have the issue of potential finds of early man sites. I mean, we know, for example, there are Clovis points in the uplands of Connecticut, but it's not impossible that, in fact, it's likely that there are remains from, if you will, early man in the New World in the offshore arena as well. People in Florida have spent years and tons of money with NSF grants, National Science Foundation grants, and so forth, looking for drowned sites, along the, particularly the north coast of the northern part of Florida, along the Panhandle, because such sites are found in the rivers. The Osceola River has produced mastodons and so on and so forth, and there are a couple of sites in the Gulf of Mexico that have produced some really interesting data. So I think that gets back to what Dave said about the land-sea interface being a false boundary. Then when you jump to the historic period and you start to look at Dutch and English exploration and settlement, of New England, you also have to keep in mind that the water was the highway. There were fundamentally no towns early on in the interior, right? The colonies started on the coast. Connecticut is a maritime state. It's a water state, And when the English settled the eastern end of Long Island, they founded towns all the way along the north shore of the Sound, like Stonington, one of my favorites, or Mystic, Stamford, Bridgeport, which then was Pequannock, New London, and that became, if you will, the economic engine for trade and for shipbuilding and so on. And during our work on the Hurricane Sandy recovery project, there was a shipwright or more in virtually every town up the Connecticut River, and some towns like Middletown had really active shipbuilding. Even little coastal towns, that are now part of the larger governments had shipbuilders. And so water was not an impediment. I mean, it facilitated trade and interaction. There were virtually no roads early on. There were no interior marketplaces, no supply centers. Everything happened from the coast. And, I spent a lot of time in the Stonington area, and I'm much enamored of it. It's a wonderful historic place. But, the history of maritime activity there, by the way, it became the first U.S. Customs House much later, but it was really the point of debarkation for the West India trade. The guys who founded Stonington had left Rhode Island and built the first wharf in Stonington, the Dennisons, and then you had great ship captains and shipbuilders moving in. They were active in the West India trade, and one of them, Palmer, was the first American to lay his eyes on Antarctica in 1820. I mean, that's relatively early, on a sealing expedition where they ran out of seals and pushed further south. And now the Palmer Peninsula and Palmer Land in Antarctica is named after one of the great ship captains out of Stonington, who then came back and started making clipper ships, and for years held records for intercontinental travel between Brazil, Rio, and London, and so forth, and built his clipper ships from models in the days before drawings, right? And so when we think of Connecticut historically, we should think of it as a water state. I mean, it was 1815 when the first steamship was built in Connecticut, and they made them till well into the 19th century. And again, Stonington was one of the last. Stonington and New London were the last two terminals for steamships, in the state, and until about 1890. And then after that, everything changed because intermodal transport started, and you had stuff coming off the ships and going onto the ships from the railroad. And so the history of Connecticut is inextricably tied to the water. And all of those shipwrecks that are out in Long Island Sound, and there are thousands of them, and a lot have not yet been discovered, as Dave suggested, are a mirror of the history and the maritime focus of the state. So, it's kind of the same trajectory if you look at the pre-contact period and the historic period. If the land was there, and if it was coastal or along a river, it was easier to get to, easier to work, easier to extract resources, and easier to trade with other folks, whether it was in the West Indies or Ireland or England or Scotland or wherever during the historic period. But the same thing up and down the coast. And so, it's the land-sea interface is a false divide in the sense that, people would use the, simple approach of the path of least resistance to get what they needed, to trade for what they needed, and to get where they needed to go. And water was the superhighway.
Hey, if I can ask, I feel like this is the ultimate intersection of Indiana Jones meets Jacques Cousteau. That one of you guys should be wearing a fedora and the other should have a snorkel in his mouth. But if I know there's no set rules, and I know that everything changes, and certainly there are different inbound requests and opportunities that come across your desks on a regular basis. But in general, can you describe some of the greatest point of source material that might initiate a discovery process? Would it be historical documents, a shipping line's log books, captain's logs? Would it be newspapers? What might be the greatest source of initial discovery for you?
Dave, you want to tackle that?
Well, I would just say that all the above and then some would be, I think, the most appropriate answer. The archival record that includes the things that you just mentioned, as well as newspaper accounts, every port of any size, at a customs house, things were being documented that were coming in and out of the ports, and when ships were late, they'd be presumed lost if they never showed up. But one of the things that we know is that the majority of vessels and watercrafts that are submerged and in the archaeological record underwater are not documented. So there's really no replacement for going out and doing survey in the water and doing exploration in the water. And one of the things I thought of as Chris was talking is that, not every archaeological site is underwater, but every single archaeological site is tied to water, whether it's water as a resource to drink, or water as a resource and a place for abundance of life that people are taking advantage of, whether it's plants or animals to survive, or water as a transportation route. Water is absolutely essential to human life forever. So the underwater world and accessing it and exploring it are extremely important if we want to fully understand the totality of human history. But in terms of how to access the information, how to access these sites, there's all these documentary sources that you can use. But the other thing to think about, there's a national database, the Automated Wreck and Obstruction Information System, that's operated by NOAA. Ground truthing of that database has shown that it is pretty wildly inaccurate. The fact is we know only a little about where most of the archaeological sites are underwater, and we have to recognize that the documentary record is imperfect. When ships sink, people are usually in a state of panic. The locational information for these things that's recorded in the archival record is often not that great. So there's no replacement for actually getting out there and doing the surveys to try to identify things.
Along Dave's line of thought, I know Sarah's office is always getting emails and phone calls from the general public about sites that they found or artifacts that they found. Do you guys find that same kind of thing with underwater sites? Are people or recreational divers, reporting those to you guys for further exploration or for inventory purposes?
Let me tell you an anecdote about recreational divers in Connecticut waters, because it's interesting. When we were doing our surveys in Long Island Sound as part of the Hurricane Sandy recovery project, one objective of which was to figure out what damage the hurricane caused to previously recorded shipwrecks. Part of it was a process of discovery. But we found 6 barges off of Fisher's Island, near New London, and 5 of them were wooden barges. One of them was wooden hulled, but had iron struts and supports. Spent a lot of time researching whether or not it was a barge train that sank, for example, in a cyclonic storm like the Great New England Hurricane in 1938. We plowed through the records to see if there were reports of multiple barges being sunk in that geography. We developed multiple working hypotheses about how those barges were sunk. By the way, they're in really good shape. We actually recommended Connecticut SHPO's office consider creating an archaeological preserve at what we called a barge graveyard, because it was kind of a fossil of 19th, early 20th century barges. By about 1890, the barges that were being made in New London were all steel. They were all metal. And by 1925, the wooden barges were gone. And they were producing steel barges out of an assembly line like production in New London. So here you have kind of the trajectory leading up to that technological change to barges that could be bigger, they could be longer, they could be towed more easily, they could carry more tonnage and so forth. But I got on the phone with a sport diver from New London who had actually dove on those barges. And he said, nah, they weren't lost in a storm, man, they were scuttled. And I'll tell you how we know. Number one, there was no cargo on them, and number two, they were stripped down to the short block. They even took the fasteners. So what we have is, either a single episode or multiple episodes of scuttling of old barges in a fairly safe area for having done so, because it wasn't in any approaches to any major channels. But we would not have known that without diving. Our charge was to run the remote sensing array and analyze the data. We got wonderful multi-beam imagery of them. We were able to measure them and characterize them and so forth, but we didn't have that bird's eye view from the sport diver. I think the diving community has an amazing amount of knowledge and an amazing amount to contribute to preservation of shipwrecks in Connecticut waters. And I would encourage our new state archaeologists to continue to reach out to them. They're like a distant early warning system, right? They'll find stuff that is not recorded. As Dave said, the automated wreck and obstruction information system is notoriously inaccurate. Well, and there are good reasons for that. I mean, one is they were charting obstructions to navigation, hazards to navigation. That was the purpose of those surveys. Number two, most of the wrecks that were recorded were done so initially before the advent of satellite, GPS technology. So the accuracy is less than excellent. And using the old Loran system, you can spend days looking for a target and not find it. But the divers know where a lot of these things are. So do fishermen, because they fish off of them. So, the public has so much to contribute to preservation of shipwrecks in Connecticut waters that I think that the program for dealing with them ought to be made more attractive, to them to participate. And we ought to be seeking information, because that information is generally eyewitness accounts. They may not know exactly what they're looking at because they're not studied, but some of them have really gotten into it and, learned the appropriate terminology and can describe things marvelously. But go back to the previous question about what we would call the direct historical approach, which you use to try and figure out what might be there, and then when you find something, to try and figure out what it is. You got to keep in mind that for the pre-contact period, that doesn't work, right? And the interest of the tribes in an ancestral landscape is going to be confirmed by hardcore archaeological research, because there is no written record. And one of the things one does to get a handle on that is to interview elders and hear their stories and learn what they know and what their expectations are, because they understand from their own educational system. It's every bit as good as formal education, and better in some ways. What their expectations are, and how they would approach this. So there's also kind of an ethnographic approach that wants to be taken to deal with the pre-contact sites. Dave does a lot of that and has done a lot of that as well. I spend a lot of time working with tribes, and every now and then just get absolutely flummoxed by what they come up with. And the example I'll give you of that is out in Oregon, Dave and I were at a conference in New Orleans many years back now, and saw a presentation about the changes to the Oregon coastline when the tectonic plates shifted and the coastline dropped 400 feet every time it happened at about a 500-year cycle. There was a fabulous article about this in the New Yorker a year or two ago. Well, the geologists, marine geologists there actually C-14 dated these ghost forests that had been submerged like a staircase. And the last one was in the 1700s. And no white man remembers it. No white man saw it. But they still tell the story around the campfires of the Nez Perce tribe and the Confederated tribes because it made an impression and it is part of their oral tradition. And so if you want to know about it, other than studying it from a hardcore scientific standpoint, talk to the tribal peoples. They will remember.
That's fascinating.
Can you guys spend the night with us? Do you mind if we just go, just roll into another hour? It's the kid in me. I got to ask: is there an artifact? Is there a site that has channeled you to so much that you would want to go if you could, in a safe and way? If you could go back to a certain era, a certain place, if you could go back to where a site would have been in its current day. What era would you go back to? What place would you go back to? What is it that would fascinate you so much that you would want to time travel and actually be there to witness firsthand what might have happened?
Well, when you think of the totality of human history that you have just offered us to choose from, that's a pretty tough one to pick the one thing. And what I find is that all these projects that I work on, whatever you're working on at that moment, because it's archaeology, because you're dealing with archaeological remains of these past human activities, you're always dealing with the smallest, usually, amounts of residue of those activities. You don't ever get that complete picture that you wish you had that would make the interpretation so much easier. So, you have to do a lot of imagining. And so it's like every single project that I work on, whatever I'm working on at that moment, I'm like, I wish I could go back in time and be there to understand these little crumbs, these little clues that I have to work with. It's like it's like doing when you do underwater archaeology, it's like doing a puzzle where you don't have the box cover to see the picture and what it's supposed to look like. And you have about 10% of the pieces of the puzzle, and the ones you have are soggy and they're all beat up and pieces of them are missing. For me, I think I would like to go back into the ancient time and see that continental shelf as exposed land, and to see how people were interacting with it and what those cultures were like, and to watch how they responded over time in the same way that now we're faced with having to respond. Because of sea level rise on the increase right now at a rate that it was like 12,000 years ago, to see how they responded to that encroachment of the water coming over the land, both just from a logistical standpoint, but also from a spiritual standpoint, from a ceremonial standpoint, from all of it. How did they understand and think about what was going on?
But I kind of agree with Dave on that. I've been dealing with studies of climate change from the archaeological perspective, and I want to see the guy make the first atlatl. I am convinced that the reason that atlatl was made was because of the advent of aridity during the Holocene period. Prior to that, we characterized, the Clovis people as big game hunters. They had mastodon, they had bison antecus, they had all kinds of big food animals that they hunted with thrusting implements. But as the climate changed at the beginning of the Holocene and over the first couple of centuries of the Holocene, those animals moved on and died out, right? And new edges were created, the edge effect from ecology, and animals like deer began to populate those edges, and they're a lot faster. I think the data from stone tools shows that the transition from large fluted lancelet points for thrusting or throwing implements were replaced by a period of experimentation with side-notched and corner-notched points that could be fitted to a spear thrower, if you will, to get the faster edge creatures that were coming in as the environment changed with incredible rapidity. I think, we're apparently entering into a period, and I think we can see it in our local weather over a period of time, where climate is going to change again. And the message that I'm getting out of looking at that period at the end of the Pleistocene and the first few centuries of the Holocene is they had to reinvent themselves. They had to completely reinvent their toolkit. They had to survive, and in order to do so, they had to make major changes in their economy. It may have affected their social structure. It may have affected their demography. There's some indication that population dropped after the early Holocene and then rebounded far later on the coasts where there was more available food. So I'd like to see that guy make the first atlatl and have him tell me what he was thinking and what he had seen, because I think there are messages for the future as well that we can glean from these archaeological data. And I wonder how we're going to reinvent ourselves. How are we going to reinvent our technology in order to face some of the changes that we need to face?
And
technology is what they did, but
I'd love to see the FOSA atlatl champion, Gary Knopf, take him on. That's the match that I think we have a throwdown in the making in the virtual world. Hey, I know we only have a couple of minutes left, and before Sarah closes everything out, I do want to give everybody a chance. First, I want to remind all of our listeners that this Archaeology of Connecticut is powered by our friends at FOSA, at Friends of the Office of State Archaeology. So we thank you, Scott, and on all the good people there for helping us bring this to life. This has been phenomenal. But could everybody around the virtual roundtable please share their information on how people might be able to find, follow, social media, anything that you want to share? Now's the time.
Sure, I'll go real quick. Friends of the Office of State Archaeology. We have a Facebook page for Connecticut, Friends of the Office of State Archaeology, Connecticut. Our website is fosa-ct.org, so fosa-ct.org, and you can find information about us in both places.
And in Massachusetts, the Board of Underwater Archaeological Resources, we have a website as well. If you just Google Mass Board of Underwater Archaeological Resources, or MABUAR, will pop up, and our website has a whole variety of different links and sections, everything from frequently asked questions to policy guidance to information on shipwreck sites off the coast. So I welcome anybody to take a look at it, and please feel free to reach out to me and contact me anytime by email. I'd be answer questions and talk to anybody who's got an interest in underwater archaeology.
My website's www.rcgoodwin.com. And one more plug, sport divers, get in touch with your new state archaeologist and help us to get eyes on things that we don't know about in Connecticut waters and we should know about. There is an active underwater archaeological preserve program. We need more of them in order to protect those heritage resources for future generations. We need your help.
Yeah, and I would second that, what Chris just said. Please reach out to us. You can follow the Office of State Archaeology on our Facebook page or contact us through our website at osa.uconn.edu. Just a couple of weeks ago, actually, we received information about a new submerged site from just a member of the public who came across it. So, we really need everybody's help to preserve our archaeological heritage in Connecticut, and please feel free to reach out. We're happy to work with the public on these issues. Thank you guys so much for coming on the show tonight. This was really great. It would be great maybe in the future sometime we could do a couple of shows more dedicated to just different aspects of underwater archaeology, like shipwrecks or something like that, and just something to keep in mind for the future. But I really appreciate you guys coming on. It was a great show.
Thanks. A lot of fun.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah.
So appreciate you.
Thank you.